All right, now you remember that oath we all swore that we would be infidel sharks? All right, this is your opportunity. This is a quote. This explains where bull rakes come from. And it's a thing that was told to me by a really old salt. It's a guy I'm sure the shellfishermen here, I'm not going to say his name, but I'm sure the shellfishermen here will know who it is. I called him up and I told him about this salon. I said, yeah, it's up in Providence. And he says, Providence? I haven't been out East Greenwich in 50 years. So here's what he said. This is what he told me where bull rakes come from. You know where bull rakes come from. This is true. Everybody was tonging, and they're going along the shore, right? So the Indians come out shooting arrows. Had to keep going back. Didn't want to get hit. So that's when the bull rakes came in. I don't know if this is true or not, but this is what I was told. That's what I heard. Makes sense. They use it for money. It's like robbing a fucking bank. Hey, he just made $1 million in our fucking land. White motherfucker. That's what started all this trouble with the Indians. The bull rake. Infidel sharks, you said it was okay. The bull rake is about getting into deeper water. You've got your treading, your scratch raking, intertidal kind of zones. You've got your tonging. Tongs go up to maybe 20 feet, would you say? That's about the top length. We know tongs, the scissor-like operation that you use to dig up quahaugs. The bull rake, although we have heard otherwise, was probably invented in New Jersey in 1863. And that's the old kind of bull rake. It didn't get, by this guy named George Eldridge. Yeah, I'll get to it in just a sec. It didn't really take hold in Rhode Island until about 1970 or so. Tonging was... All right.
1970?
1970, yeah. Tonging was very popular all the way up till then. So, this is what they call a keyport-style bull rake. It kind of resembles an old hay rake called a bull rake, but it's smaller. It's blacksmith forged, believe it or not. This one was probably made in East Greenwich by a guy named Buster Arnold, or in a shop owned by Buster Arnold, which means it was probably put together by a guy named Louis Salisbury. They forged this. They had a blacksmithing shop there, and they put it all together. Now this is sort of the model that bull rakes had for, as they progressed throughout time. This is what they were referring to. This is sort of the basic model that they all developed from. And it had a bunch of it had three major weaknesses that I'm going to go through so you'll understand why the rake developed as it did. It shares weaknesses with the hand, okay? And that's what you need to understand about this rake. So if you dig out a quahog with your hand, you have one thumb, and that's great. All right? So when you pile the quahaugs up in your hand, you can pile them off to the right, or the left, depending on where your thumb is. But you can't pile them off onto the other side. Okay? If you had two thumbs, then you could. Initially, these rakes were made without these guards here. Okay? So quahaugs just spill right out, unless you put in a side, which they used to do. They would take sheets of tin, cut them in the shape of the tine here, and then wire them on. And then they would fall off. Okay? And it went on like this for a number of years until, supposedly, some bull rakers took a guy out who worked in a Warwick mill. And he saw them losing their tin sides, and he said, well, why don't you just weld some guards on there? And they said, fuck, shit. So the sides on here were likely welded, they're brazed, they were likely put on by my grandfather. So that's how that weakness was overcome. The other weaknesses here, you can see this in your own hand if you do it. You take your hand, you curl it up, dig your quahaugs, and as you sink your fingers into the mud, you lose capacity to hold the clam. The fingers that form your basket are the same fingers you use to dig with. And so it's the same here. So the teeth are not separate from the structure of the basket, right? So the deeper you dig, the more volume you lose. And we'll see how that was dealt with later. The other weakness, if you take your fingers and you curl them, you take your other hand and you squeeze your fingers together, right? You make bigger spaces, in the ones that don't close up. And so the same thing happens here. And then you leave a line of clams trailing behind the bull rake. So they had to deal with all of these problems. And so they did. This is a mud rake. Now what happened is, you can see on your little pamphlet here that there's a basket rake up top. I couldn't find a good picture of a key port. But a basket rake was in use pretty early. But they used it differently from the way that you use a bull rake. The bull rake you use with a stale like this, crossbar. They call it a splice or a T-bar. The basket rake you use just with a pole like that. No crossbar. So you'd have your basket rake out there, you would take your pole, you put it against your shoulder, and you just kind of pull it back like that, right? So you're just dragging it through the mud just a single time, just kind of pulling it back, right? Bull rake works differently. But as they were developing away from the keyport style rake, they were looking at the basket rake because it actually overcame a lot of the weaknesses that we see in the keyport. So they developed this mud rake, sometimes called a Long Island bubble rake. There are a couple rake makers here tonight. Well, maybe one only. No, only we make them too. I invited some people down from Cape Cod who make bull rakes right now, kind of on a big scale, but I guess they couldn't make it. I'll tell you about them. They're really interesting people. But this mud rake was sort of the next design after the keyport. And you can see they solved the problems, right? So you have this front bar. This is where you put the teeth. The bar also prevents these rods from squeezing together.
Does it need some orthodontia?
Yeah, it does need some orthodontia. This rake was made sometime in the late 60s by my grandfather and Howard Drew, David's father. This was a very early stainless rake. It was not perfectly well made, but stainless is important. Stainless is what all rakes are made of these days. Well, most of them.
I tell you, it looked like the Quahaugs were playing real good that day, huh?
Yes. Thanks for fighting that one. Yes. Right. I'm gonna go. Yeah.
Why did it take so long for these rakes to be adopted?
Have you met a bull raker? Because they were doing good. They were doing well with tongs. But as they kind of fished out the shallower waters, they wanted to move deeper.
I see, so that was necessary.
I mean, the Indian, kind of analogy was sort of true. They were trying to move out into deeper water, and this enabled that. The next rake that comes up is the Rhode Island rake or the Long Island rake. And this is a classic. This is the one I'm most familiar with. Long Islanders call this a Rhode Island rake. Rhode Islanders call it a Long Island rake. Shellfishermen are generous. So this is really a matter of volume. You see this kind of stretch in the back here? They call it a kick in the back. They're opening up the volume. Anything else on this that was really all that interesting? Oh, the bubble in front. Yeah. So it's really a matter of increasing the volume so you can catch more clams, and it's heavier to lift, and everybody likes that.
So there's a pole on those? You
Mhm.
rig them through with a pole, is that right?
Yeah.
You had a pole there, so
Yeah.
all of these
All right.
are
Well, let
done
me.
by
Yeah,
hand.
we can go over
with
how the
all
pole
of these
works.
are done by hand with a pole.
Yes. Yes. So this is a scale. We should go over the scale.
No, that's okay.
This is the base of the clam
One
pole.
of us is from the Midwest.
All right. Initially, when some of these old key ports, wooden stales, okay, and they were put together with a collar and a wedge. All right. So you would take your poles. The first one was called a mainstale. You would attach that to the shank or the tongue or the tang, or however they want to call it here.
Okay.
I'm gonna scratch the hell out of this thing.
Understand.
Like this.
Mhm.
Okay. And you put your collar on there, just a little loop of metal, drive a wedge into it, and that's supposed to hold it tight, which it doesn't always. That connects, the mainstale connects either with your splice or with what they call go-betweens, which are notched poles. And they fit together at the notches. So each one is mated like that. They slide steel rings over them to hold them in place. Those were tough to work. They really chewed up your hands, but they did enable guys to go into deeper water. The other problem is that that they had was they would snap. You had to be kind of ginger with them. You know, one guy said about my grandfather. My grandfather was one of the first guys to go into deeper water, and this guy said your grandpa used to bust about a stale a week, you know, because he was going into deeper water and trying to use these wooden stales. So then aluminum came along, and it gave you a stronger stale, enabled you to go into deeper water. I've heard of people using lengths 80, 90, 100 feet, which is interesting because that's about the length of a whale. So that's the basic idea. I'll do a little bit more with rakes, but I want to get back to Melville for a moment. All right. Queequeg shaves. Ishmael says, I was watching to see where he kept his razor, when lo and behold, he takes his harpoon from the bed corner, slips out the long wooden stock, unsheaths the head, wets it a little on his boot, and striding up to the mirror against the wall, begins a vigorous scraping or harpooning of his cheeks. Now, panel of experts, anybody? The teeth can be quite sharp. Has anybody shaved with a tooth? No? Queequeg eats. To be sure, I cannot speak for his breeding. His greatest admirer could not have cordially justified his bringing his harpoon into breakfast with him, and using it there without ceremony, reaching over the table with it to the immediate jeopardy of many heads and grappling the beefsteak towards him. But that was certainly very coolly done by him, and everyone knows that in most people's estimation, to do anything coolly is to do it genteelly. Have we eaten a beefsteak with a bull rake?